Right, good evening, everyone. I'm so happy to see you all here for the last night of our mission. Before we jump into tonight's topic, I do want to do just like we did last night, right? Raise your hand. How many of you were here either last night or the night before? Beautiful, wonderful. How many of you, this is your first night here? Oh, a handful, fantastic. We're so glad that you were able to make it this evening. And so tonight, we're going to be talking about how do we discover our faith story and actually learn how to share that, start sharing that with others. That's kind of what we're going to be talking about tonight. But before we start that, what I'd like you to do, just like we have the last two nights, if you can find a group of 3 or 4 total people sitting around you, and if you were here yesterday, if you can share with your little group one thing that stuck with you from yesterday's presentation. And if you were not here yesterday, that's just fine. If you can share with your group maybe what brought you here this evening. And the only thing I'm going to ask is if you would please make sure if you were not here yesterday, you sit with some people who were, so that you can hear a little bit from them about maybe what they took away from yesterday's talk. Make sense? So take a couple minutes now, introduce yourselves, right? And have a couple minutes to talk about those things. Take 1 minute to wrap up your conversation. All right. Thank you so much for taking the time to share with each other a little bit about what you took away from our last conversation together, our last time together. So this mission has been on the power of story, right? On the first night, we talked about why story has power in general, more big picture. And then yesterday we talked about what it means to become God's storytellers, to enter in ourselves to the story that God is writing throughout all of salvation history, throughout all of creation, and in our own lives. And now tonight we're going to say, now what does that mean in terms of how I would share that and why I should share not just the story, but my story in particular with other people. Before I get too much further in, tonight's going to end a little bit differently than we've ended the other nights, so I want to do some show and tell before I forget. A couple of resources that I recommend. Some of them, there might still be copies on the table, I'm not sure. One of them is this book. It's called Loved as I Am. It is, some of you might be familiar with Sister Miriam James Heidland. The Salt Sister does the podcast and works with John Paul the Healing Center, right? She's here, local-ish to here. This is her story of conversion. This book, Loved as I Am, what that experience was like for her. It's very short, a very easy read, and I can hear it in her voice when I read her book, which is just such a soothing, loving voice, I think. So this is a fantastic just resource in terms of what does it look like for someone to share their story. And she has a pretty powerful story as well. Other resource, I had someone ask me, do you have these talks somewhere? So first of all, there will be on the Parish YouTube channel, all 3 nights of the mission, if you want to share them with somebody or go listen to them again. I also have done a mission before that is last night's content, but over 3 days. So we can get more into each kind of piece of that. And there are, if you still listen to CDs, if you have a way to play CDs, I don't even know. I don't think I do even in my vehicles anymore. But there's a set of 3 CDs on the table as well that are from a mission where we did that charismatic proclamation over 3 days. So if you're interested in those, or you can download them on our website as MP3s as well. Those might be helpful to you. And then lastly, these are new resources I didn't put out until tonight because they're directly related to what we're talking about tonight. These are reflection packets that will be on the table as well. The first one is called Discover Your Story. So after we go through this evening, if you're still struggling and you're like, I don't even know if I have a story, or I don't know what my story would be, or how I would even start to think about what my story might look like, this might be a helpful reflection for you to walk through. It walks through asking questions about your life, asking questions about things that have happened to you, moments of change, right? Just kind of helps walk through in a little bit more intentional way, helping you discover what your story might be. If after we get done with tonight, you're like, oh no, I think I have a pretty good idea what my story is, then this might be a better reflection for you. And this one is called Unpacking Your Story. And what this one does is says, how can you take your story and put it in a framework that's helpful for sharing with other people? So this one's about what is my story. This one is how do I share my story. So if those are helpful for you, feel free to grab them, or you can go to our website and download them there too. So it's totally up to you. You do not have to take the packets whatsoever. And then the last resource I want to share with you is this tiny little booklet. I think I only have like 3 or 4 of them left on my table, but you can get them super cheap online. This is called The Ultimate Relationship. It's a very simple, short, little booklet that goes through the proclamation in a very simple and easy way. It was created by a group called Catholic Christian Outreach. They are the Focus Campus Ministry in Canada. That's what they are, their version. Actually, they were first. And Focus was based off of their model in Canada. So really phenomenal little thing. I carry one of these around with me whenever I travel. And I know how to proclaim the Kerygma, right? But sometimes it's still helpful to just have a little tool, a little resource, a little something to point to with pictures and just a couple of words on it. If you go to their website, they have whole trainings on how to use this to present the Kerygma message to someone. So, but it's a great little resource that I highly recommend. Focus on what we talked about last night. So those are just a couple of the things. Some of them I still have on the table back there. There will be a lot more. Well, there are already from the last 2 nights. A lot more resources on our website if you're interested in that. Okay, so diving into our topic for tonight. I know I said if you're walking around feeling like, I don't know, do I have a story? I don't even know if God's done anything. I don't know if I have anything worth sharing. I want you to hear me say very clearly, you have a story. Wherever you are in your life right now, wherever you are in your faith right now, you have a story. Bishop Ricken from the Diocese of Green Bay likes to say, everyone is somewhere. No one is nowhere. Where you are is where you are, and that's okay. Jesus will meet you there. And the message he really is trying to get across is that God is working in each of our lives all of the time, constantly working in our lives. And we aren't always aware of it. We don't always have the eyes to see it. We don't always recognize it when it's happening, but it doesn't change the reality that he is actively working in each of our lives every single day. That means that you do have a story. It just might take you some time to uncover all the threads of that story and where they have been woven throughout your life. And that's okay if it takes time. But sometimes people will say, yeah, but I don't have like a good story. I don't have like I was a drug addict on the side of the road, right? And Jesus appeared to me and now I'm a priest, right? Like, I don't have that story. That's okay, I don't have that story either. Or I didn't have like the St. Paul story, right? Like Jesus didn't knock me off my horse as I was headed to go kill his followers, blind me, and then send me off to be healed by somebody so that he could make me into his #1 writer of scripture. Well, that's okay, that's not my story either. The problem is that we think that because many of the people who have gotten the most comfortable sharing their stories have such big stories that we think that, well, then we don't really have anything worth sharing because it doesn't look like those big stories look. But I want you to know it doesn't have to look like a big story. And in fact, not only does it not have to, but we who don't have big stories need to get even more comfortable sharing our story so that other people who don't have big stories know that doesn't mean God's not working. I was on a confirmation retreat with high schoolers one time, and we'd been sitting in small group, and the small group leaders were sharing just a piece, right, of their kind of moment of encounter and conversion that they had, a little piece of their own witness and testimony. And, we're inviting the kids in their small group to think about if they had that ever happen to them or if they wanted it to happen to them. And one of the girls came out of her small group, and she came up to me, and she was like, Kristen, she's like, I'm so frustrated. It's like, why? Why are you frustrated? She said, I'm so frustrated because I just want my epiphany. Like all these people, they talk about this massive epiphany they've had. She's like, I just want my epiphany. How come I've never had that? And I just said to her, I said, I can't answer that for you. I said, all I can do is tell you that if you feel like you haven't had it, ask for it. Ask God for it. See what happens. Right? See what happens. We went like 3 more sessions on this retreat, and she comes out of the third whatever thing that they were doing. I don't even remember what it was anymore. And she comes running out, and she's like, it happened. And I was like, what happened? And she's like, I had my epiphany. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. What was your epiphany? And she's like, God loves me. And if it was only me in the world, he still would have died on the cross. And as thrilled as I was for this young lady, there was a party that was like, yeah, no kidding. Like, this is what I have been telling you for 3 years, child. like, duh, right? Like, yes, this is the message that we've been giving you. But it wasn't until she was in a place that she could ask God for that then hearing that message actually had effect for her, right? And took her on her next step on her journey, was that kind of encounter moment for her epiphany. So, and look, that's a small story, right? I was on a confirmation retreat, and someone told me that God loved me, and I was like, oh my gosh, he actually loves me. That's huge, though, because we need more stories like that we're sharing. And each one of us has something to share. Each one of us has some way that God has worked in our lives that's worth sharing with other people. But I want us to remember what we talked about last night, first and foremost. There's there are 2 different quotes I have up on the screen because they really go together well. One of them is from Pope St. John Paul II. That's the first one. And he said, Jesus is the only gospel. We have nothing further to say or any other witness to bear. And then in The Joy of the Gospel, Pope Francis said, the primary reason for evangelizing is the love of Jesus which we have received, the experience of salvation, which urges us to even greater love of him. He doesn't say the knowledge of salvation. He says the experience of salvation, that we have had an experience of having been saved, healed, right, restored, made whole in some way. And that is what urges us to want to share with other people. And so when we start thinking about what does my story look like, what are the different pieces of my story that might be worth sharing, I want us to remember that our story needs to focus on Jesus. That our story needs to focus on Jesus. What has he done? Who has he been? When have you seen or known or felt him in your life? His presence in a particular way. That's really what this focus is. In this Catholic Christian Outreach Ultimate Relationship book, they talk about it this way. They talk about how we have places and times in our lives where Jesus is outside of our life, and then when he's a part of our life, and then a time at which we're asked to make him the center of our life. And they compare it to a marriage relationship, right? So my husband and I met in college, the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, in Taylor Hall dorm. We were both RAs, CAs, whatever you're familiar with, in the dorm at the same time. That's how we met. Before that year of college, my husband was outside my life. Right? I didn't even know who he was, had no even awareness of his existence, and he didn't have any awareness of my existence. And then he became someone who was a part of my life. So those little white like hash marks, right, are all the different parts of your life. He became a part of my life. And we were coworkers, and we were friends, and then we started dating, right? And then we got engaged. So there were times he was a smaller part of my life and got to be a bigger and bigger part of my life. But there came a moment at which he and I both had to say, I want you to now be the center of my life. I want you to be the person for me. I want you to be the one forever and ever. And we did that on our wedding day. Up until that point, we were a part of each other's lives. But that day, we made a commitment to say, you will now be the center of my life. Does that mean that I was a perfect wife? Because I had agreed to make him the center of my life? No. He was certainly not a perfect husband. Okay? I'm just saying, not a perfect husband. We had a lot of growing to do. In fact, I would tell you that after 21 years of marriage, I can tell you I'm pretty sure I didn't even know what I was doing when I agreed to make him the center of my life. Not totally. And it's been 21 years of even starting to figure out what that looks like and what that means in our lives. But there was a moment before I knew him. There was a moment we had encounter with one another and agreed to get to know each other, to grow, right? To try to figure out who is this other person? How much time do I want to spend with them? How much do I want to give up in order to be with them? And then there was the time to say, no, now you are the center of my life. And now everything else that comes after that, that's not the end by any stretch, right? Well, the same is true about our relationship with Jesus. There's a point at which Jesus is outside of my life. For those of us who were baptized as babies, that was probably a really short period of time, right? But there's a point at which he's outside of our lives. And then we have some kind of encounter with him. We have some kind of awareness of him. Some sort of time where it's like, oh, you're not just a person I heard about, but you now are a part of my life in some way, shape, or form. And we might spend time going to church and praying and talking to people about him, right? And learning about him, just like you would with somebody who was a friend or maybe that you were dating, where you're trying to get to know each other and figure out who this person is. But there comes a point at which we have the invitation to say, Jesus, I want to make you now the center of my life. I want to be your disciple. I want to live the way you want me to live. Does that mean when we make that decision that we are perfect Christians? No, not by any stretch of the imagination, right? It just means that we've made a commitment to say yes. We've had a conversion, a change of being in ourselves to say, I want to now look at the world and my life and my decisions through this new lens. Just like when I married my husband, that's what I was saying, right? I want to look at my world and my life and my decisions through the lens of we, not just me anymore. So the question, I was at an event where you might be familiar with Peter Kreeft. He's an author, Catholic author who's written a lot of things. And I was at a presentation where he was presenting on this relationships diagram. And I say that because I want you to know that what I'm about to tell you, it's his words, not mine. Okay? So he said this: what image best represents your relationship with Jesus right now? Well, he's probably not outside your life because you're here. Right? Probably not outside your life because you're here. So for you to be here, you probably have had some kind of encounter with him. Some way in which he's broken into your life and kind of prompted you to say, oh, this person might actually be real and worth getting to know. So is that where you are? Are you in a place where you can say, no, I have definitely said to him, I want you to be the center of my life? And Peter Kreeft says, there's no 2.5. Because honestly, I've done this with groups before, right? Where I'm like, we get the relationship diagram, circle where you think you are. And they like circle between 2 and 3. Okay, there's no 2.5. Just like there was no point at which I was sort of married or kind of pregnant. It doesn't work that way, right? You either have said yes to the vows at your wedding day, or you have not yet said the vows at your wedding day. You either are pregnant or you aren't pregnant. It's a binary proposition. So some of us might actually be able to point to a time in our lives where we know we said yes to Jesus. We might remember that moment. It might have been a particular moment that we can recognize and identify. And some of us might go, I don't know. I don't know if I have or not. I'm not sure. Doesn't mean you haven't. Doesn't mean you haven't. What Peter Kreeft said when he was presenting this is, if you're not sure, he said, then imagine if you were to, God forbid, die on your way home from this mission tonight. And not St. Peter, not angels, not Mary, Jesus himself were to meet you at the gates of heaven, and he were to look at you and say, "Why should I let you in?" what would your answer be? He suggested that if our answers sound like a spiritual resume, well, you should let me in because I'm a pretty good person. I've never murdered anyone. I go to church. I pray. I read the Bible. I do good works. I take care of the poor. I. Well, I won't say what he said. I'm going to say it a little more gently. There may be a deeper invitation for us if that's our answer. What he said was the answer that indicates that we probably have said yes to Jesus is some answer that focuses not on what we have done, but on what he has done. So something like Jesus says, "Why should I let you in?" Because, Lord, you suffered, died, and rose in order to bring me back into relationship. And I have not done that perfectly, and I have fallen, and I have sinned. But you have promised that everyone who depends on you, who becomes your disciple, has this door opened for them again. And I've accepted that invitation. And I gotta tell you, I really hope there's a part of me that is like, and then he's gonna ask, how do I know that you've said yes to that invitation? I can be like, look at everything I've done, right? I don't think that's the case. I'd like to believe that sometimes, but I don't think that's the case. But the reality is that we need to be in touch with our own relationship with Jesus and where we are on our journey in order to be able to start thinking about how we might share parts of our journey with others. And this is where it gets really important, okay? So Sherry Waddell wrote a book called Forming Intentional Disciples. And she identified that we really have 3 different spiritual journeys that we go on in our lives. 3 different spiritual journeys, okay? The first spiritual journey is the one we just talked about, the interior journey, the personal interior journey. The one that is, when have I encountered Jesus in my life? When has he brought me healing, wholeness, or restoration? What has he invited me to, and how have I accepted that invitation? This is a journey that's so interior that there usually is not a way to be able to look at someone and tell, even someone you know really well. Unless they've told you about their experience, there's not really a way to know if that's where they've been, if that's who they are, if that's the experience they've had, right? That's something each of us only really knows for ourselves, what that personal interior journey looks like, that interior relationship with Jesus. The second spiritual journey that we're on is the ecclesial journey. That's our journey into the church. This is the journey of the sacraments of initiation. Right? We've been baptized into life with Christ. We come to the altar, we receive the Eucharist to be fed, to be sent, right? To worship together. And in confirmation, we are sent out on mission to live the mission of the church and build up the church. This is the ecclesial journey into the church. And then we have the final journey, which is the journey of active practice. This is the journey of what you can see most often in people's lives. They pray, they do good things, they volunteer at church, right? They show up to the things, they're super active, they're often, joyful people and giving and generous people, right? This sort of active practice. And the reason this is so important for us to know is that we can confuse these 3 journeys. Now, in an ideal world, which we already know we don't live in, but if we did, this is what these 3 journeys would look like. Someone would have an encounter with God that would prompt them to say, I'm interested in learning more. They would have an experience with Jesus that made them say, oh my goodness, this man who I didn't even know before has now brought me whatever it is, some sort of healing, some sort of wholeness, some sort of restoration. And because of that, he's invited me into relationship with him, and I have these people in a community who are inviting me to now enter into this relationship with him. They're speaking to me about what that means into my life, and so I'm choosing to get baptized. to say yes to this invitation. And then I have this community that's now walking with me on what does that even mean to say yes to Jesus. I have a community that's walking with me into this life of discipleship to learn who is this Jesus that has asked me to conform my heart to his. And what does that even look like? What does he teach? What does he say? And we gather together every week so that I can hear that and be surrounded with people who also want to hear that. And we get to receive him to be strengthened to live out that yes that we've given ever more strongly and ever more deeply every single week. And then there comes a point at which I have grown so much in my relationship with Jesus, in my understanding and feeling supported by a faith community, that I actually can't keep this to myself anymore. That I feel like I am being called to go out and share with other people outside of my church who this Jesus is, so I can invite them to have the same experience that I have had. And the church has brought me to confirmation to send me out on mission to go and do that work outside of the church. And I go and I do that work outside the church and I bring other people back and the process repeats itself. Now, other than the very early days of the church, the Acts of the Apostles, I don't know of anybody who's had that journey, where the initial steps of each of these three journeys all lined up perfectly with one another. Usually, our journeys are a lot messier, right? A lot of us, myself included, I would say, were sacramentalized, run through what felt like at times a conveyor belt of sacraments of initiation and spit out the end and told we were now adults in the church. But I didn't even have a relationship with Jesus. I didn't even know who he was, other than someone I had learned about as a historical figure, just like I had learned about Abe Lincoln. And they each had about as much to do with my life as the other one. That's a common experience that people have. Or you might have people who have a journey of active practice in the faith. They're engaged in their community of faith, and they're doing all the things because they matter and they bring you life, and you feel good when you're around other people who are believing the same things that you do. And yet, if you ask them, they can't tell you about a time that Jesus has made a tangible difference in their life. They might be able to tell you about a time the church made a tangible difference in their life. But the person of Jesus, not so much. My maternal grandmother was one of these people. My maternal grandmother, when she was in her mid-80s, I love my grandma. She went to Mass every day. She prayed the rosary twice a day, once for our country and once for the intentions of her family. And she went to confession once a week. And I found this out, and I remember thinking to myself, how holy is this woman? How holy do you have to be someone who in her mid-80s slept most of the time and yet still felt the need to go to confession once a week? Like, what is happening in her heart that she feels the need to confess things that she is just thinking? And I have a hard time sometimes going to confess the things I actually do that are bad. Right? I'm like, what is happening? So my grandmother came for Thanksgiving this particular year, and we had just started our Burning Hearts apostolate ministry. We were sitting around before dinner talking, and she was asking me about Burning Hearts and what we were doing. And as I was sharing with her, and I kind of got done, she looked at me and she went, why do you get all like that? I was like, what do you mean like that? You get all like bouncy and loud. You're not wrong, Grandma. I do get bouncy and loud. And I said, I just have to tell you that this just brings me so much joy. And I thought this was going to be a moment of connection, right? And I said, Grandma, I said, why do you go to Mass every day and pray the rosary and go to confession, right? Like, because there's something about it that brings us joy, that brings us peace. I said, and I feel the same way about this ministry that we're doing. And my grandmother looked right at me and said, I don't get joy from those things. I was like, you don't? She said, no. I said, well, why do you do them then? She said, because I'm supposed to. I do them because I'm supposed to. And as we talked more, I came to understand that my grandmother, for example, going to confession once a week, was less about her desire to repent, right, and get back into right relationship with God, as it was she had been told that if you die in a state of grace, you go to heaven. And when you come out of confession, you're in a state of grace. And therefore, as she was getting closer to death, she was like, the more times I go to confession, the better chance I have that my death might happen while I'm still in a state of grace. She was going to confession as an insurance policy against hell. When I asked my grandmother about her relationship with Jesus, she said to me, I do not have a relationship with Jesus. She said, that would be inappropriate. I was like, what do you mean like an inappropriate relationship with Jesus, Grandma? And she's like, no, because he is God, I am not. And there is no relationship there. And it made me aware that all of these things that I had seen my grandmother do, I had made assumptions about what that meant was going on inside her heart, without ever before having asked her what actually was going on, without ever having before asked her for her story about what faith was like for her. Now, I don't know, my grandmother died during COVID, and my mom and some of her sisters were able to be there, but the rest of us were not, and the funeral was just the handful of people who had been around while she was sick at the end because of COVID. So I don't know where my grandmother was when she actually passed away, right? And I believe that there is grace in her obedience, for sure. I believe that there is grace in her obedience. But I will tell you, it makes me sad to think that she lived at least 80-some years of her life living out this journey of active practice and an ecclesial journey without ever experiencing the fruits of the personal journey. And I don't think I would have stuck with it that long if that were me. I don't think I could have stayed in the church and doing all those things for that long without getting something interiorly for myself. But I tell you that also as a reminder that if we were doing a parish mission at my grandmother's parish at that time, and I would ask the people at her parish to think about who they knew in their parish who could talk about their relationship with Jesus, I am almost certain my grandmother's name would have been on their list because it looked like it from the outside. So we can't ever assume where someone is in their personal interior journey, because what it looks like on the outside might not be what's happening on the inside. And I want you to know that, because this is also why when you have an interior journey, it's so important to share. It's so important to share what that story has been for you, what God has done for you, because it opens people up to the possibility that maybe there's something more. And do you know how easy of a step it is from someone who's been through the ecclesial journey and is deep into their journey of active practice? It is such an easy step into that journey, that personal interior journey, because they've been surrounded by it their whole lives. And it makes everything that they've learned come alive and on fire. People will often talk about the youth. And look, former youth minister. My husband is a high school teacher, and we have teenagers. And absolutely the youth matter. But I will tell you that if you are not a youth, so do you. They say the youth are the future of the church. Are you still here? Yes, then you are also, for as long as you're around, the future of the church. Because you also have stories. You also have things that have happened in your life. You also have years, decades, in many cases, of sacramental graces that you've received. of participation in this journey of active practice and in the life of a community that has lifted you up, and you have something worth sharing with the church. The most on-fire evangelists that I know are not young people. The most on-fire, fruitful evangelists I know are people in their 60s and 70s who've lived this exterior journey for their entire lives and just recently had an encounter with Jesus that changed their hearts. And they are on fire. On fire. So your stories matter. It's important. All right, last caveat before we dive in is this. We sometimes think that people who talk about being a disciple or a missionary disciple, or that people who talk about, right, what Jesus has done in their lives, or as we continue to take these steps closer in invitation from him, we accept that invitation and we walk closer to him, that somehow we're reading this like holiness pinnacle. We've climbed the mountain of faith and we're there, right? I'm at the top, woohoo, sainthood for me. But the reality is that for every single one of us, discipleship is not a height of holiness, it's a depth of relationship. There is no top of the mountain for us to get to. It also means that when you look around you and you see people that you think are super holy, they're not super holy, they're super holy, right? It's a depth of relationship that they've gone into. And because our God is infinite, the depth of that relationship, the possibility there is infinite as well. There is always deeper that we can go into relationship with him. Just read some of the stories of some of the saints. I don't know about you, but sometimes I read some and I'm like, what are you even talking about? How is that your experience of God? Where were you in that relationship that you could go there? Because that is not where I am at, not even remotely. But each one of us can always take one more step into a deeper relationship. And the beautiful thing is that our relationship, this staircase is a spiral. The depth, right, is a spiral, which means we can encourage other people, even who are deeper than we are in that relationship. By sharing our story, it can encourage them to take their next step, even if we think they're further along than we are. Okay, so as we look at this, here's a thing I want you to think about for yourself. When have you had an encounter with God, an encounter with Jesus? When have you had that moment that he broke into your life, that he made you know that he was real, that he showed up in a different or a particularly profound or meaningful way for you? That's the first step of sharing our stories. So I'm going to share with you for me when that experience was. I was 17 years old. I was going on the World Youth Day pilgrimage with our diocese to Paris, France. I went on this trip to Paris, France, not because I cared that it was World Youth Day, but because I wanted to go to Europe, and the only way my parents were letting me go to Europe as a teenager was if I was going with church. That's why I signed up. So we leave, we go on this trip. Lots of really cool and incredible things happened. There's a lot of amazing experiences. The most profound thing that happened to me at the opening mass for World Youth Days. So these are a couple pictures from that event. I will show off here really quickly, right? So this is Pope John Paul II, because he was Pope when that mass happened. That's him. I have, this is a better picture than the one I took. The one I took, this is gonna date myself, right? I had a disposable camera that I was using through binoculars to try to take a picture of the Pope. So I have a really giant white fuzzy blob picture in my album that's like, nope, trust me, that's the Pope. This was the racetrack that the opening mass was held on. It was a horse racing track in Paris that they converted into this outdoor stadium for mass. This little white thing up here, that's the altar, okay? This is all the people. We were like here. We were not all the way back, but we were still pretty far back, so it was very far away. We participated in this mass by putting on a Walkman that had the radio station tuned for your language so that you could understand the Mass. Because it's World Youth Day, right? So there are people from all over the world that are here and participating, and they had translators for the different languages. Most of the Mass was in French because we were in France. So they did most of the Mass in French. They had like petitions. There were like 30 petitions, it felt like, and like in all these different languages. There was one that was in English, and they might have done some of the readings, I don't remember. But I remember being able to hear the English translation. This picture is a picture of our group from behind that was taken by a priest in our diocese who, when I was giving a talk just about this experience at his parish, said, "You know, I was on that trip." I was like, "You were?" He said, "Yep." I said, "I do not." I remember like 4 people on that whole trip, right? It's like, "I'm sorry, Father, I don't remember." He goes, "Yeah." He goes and he pulls out a picture and he goes, "Are you in this picture?" I was like, "Sure enough, that's me in this super lame denim bucket hat with my little camera in my hands, in fact." I was like, "Look at that, Father, you do have a picture of me from this trip." But I like this picture because you can see, first of all the different national flags that are all around us from the different countries that were there. And way, 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 way in the distance, you can see the big, tall wall that was at the back of the altar. So we're there for this Mass. I have my headphones on for my Walkman. And I had like one ear of my headphones on and one off because I was talking to my friends and trying to not get caught by the chaperones, talking to my friends. So like this headphone was where the chaperones were standing, so it looked to them like I was paying really close attention. And over here were my friends. We're kind of chatting. And we get to the Lord's Prayer in the Mass. And this was the first moment that really struck me. Because during the Lord's Prayer, all of a sudden, this entire mass of people, I don't remember how many were there, but in my memory it was like 1 million. This entire mass of people all start saying the exact same prayer at the exact same time in hundreds of different languages. And it was just this, I couldn't even like remember the words to the Lord's Prayer in English because I was so overcome by hearing it around me in all these different languages. And I remember thinking that, like, holy cow, when they say the church is universal, they mean it. Right? I couldn't hold a conversation with most of these people. We wouldn't be able to understand each other, but we could all pray Mass because the Mass was a common language for us in that moment. And that was something that just, I remember being totally overwhelmed by. Then we get to communion. And at communion, as you can imagine, not the most reverent of communion experiences I've ever had in my life. They sent out into the crowd priests and deacons as communion ministers, only the precious body, no precious blood for this giant crowd, right? They sent them all out into the crowd with a server who was holding a blue umbrella, not dissimilar to the white umbrella that young man is holding over the Pope. But they were blue umbrellas. And the instruction was, go find the closest blue umbrella. That's where you'll get communion. So there were no ushers. There were no lines. It was just chaos. And because I know now as a youth minister, if you're going to have Mass outside, it will, in fact, rain the night before. You're going to have Mass outside, as it did this day. And so it's not just Mass chaos, it's Mass chaos in a giant mud pit. Because it had rained and now we have all these people there. And so we are stepping over puddles of mud and over backpacks and in some cases sleeping people to find the blue umbrella that we can go receive communion and then make our way back to our little square to sit down. And as you can see how packed and tightly we are, this is not a like kneel reverently after you've received communion. This is a sit with your knees in your nose. And that's it. That's what there's room for as we're sitting there. And I'd like to tell you that I was deep in prayer, but I was not. I was just kind of sitting here like this because this is what you do after you receive communion, right? You bow your head, fold your hands. And as I sat there in our little spot, all of a sudden, I started to feel a warmth that started in the like pit of my stomach and started to spread. And it spread all the way to the tips of my toes, to the tips of my fingers, and to the top of my head. I will tell you now, as an adult, it wasn't unlike on a really cold day if you have like a good whiskey, right? And you get that warmth, only it kept going, okay? I couldn't have compared it to that at that time, but I can now. But it just kept going all the way, top of my head, tips of my fingers, tips of my toes. And I remember that at one point, I looked up and looked around to make sure that nobody was looking at me, that nothing weird was happening on the outside because I was a teenage girl. This is very concerning to me. I look up, I look around, nobody is looking at me. I'm like, all right, now I'm back here. And I did then start to pray. And it wasn't a very, eloquent, moving prayer. It was so, God, what's going on? What's happening? What's this all about? That was more what the prayer was. And that was the moment that I would say the best way I can describe it is that everything that I had known and learned as a Catholic school student who was a good student, who could quote to you from the Gospel of John and the Bread of Life discourse, who could tell you about transubstantiation and that Jesus, right, isn't really present in the Eucharist, body, blood, soul, and divinity. Could talk about substance and accidents. Could talk about how what we believe about the Eucharist is different than what other people believe about communion in their churches. All of that went from something that I knew to something that I knew. In that moment, I was 100%, absolutely beyond a shadow of a doubt, certain that Eucharist was really Jesus. For sure. I knew it. Now, we get home from this trip, and I remember also going to my first Mass in my home parish. And right before communion, I was like, wait a minute. What if it happens again? That would be so cool. So I kind of have this moment like I'm going up to communion. I go sit back down in my pew and I'm like, I am ready, God. And nothing. And I say I was a good student, but I did have a moment there where I thought maybe it was because the Pope had consecrated the Eucharist before. It was like extra super Jesus or something. Like, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. Same Jesus, no matter who consecrates it, right? But this is what was beautiful about that moment back in my home parish is even though I didn't have that experience again, I was still aware that I still knew that was Jesus. And since then, in the course of my whole life, times when I was not going to Mass on a regular basis, times when I wasn't even sure I wanted to be Catholic anymore, I still believed that Jesus was really present in the Eucharist. In fact, over the course of the last however many years of my life since that moment, there's only been one time that I ever doubted whether or not Jesus was in the Eucharist. I was working for a parish. I went to the Adoration Chapel. I'm sitting in adoration and I'm praying, and all of a sudden I'm like, I don't think that's Jesus. What the heck is wrong with me? Like, where is this? I've never doubted this. What is going on? I was like I thought I was in a crisis of faith. The next day, I'm in a parish staff meeting, and Father says, we need to make sure that we let all of our sacristans know, even if they're like a fill-in sacristan for the very first time, what the appropriate steps are and procedures are related to communion. And we're like, what are you talking about, Father? Well, I don't know if you know this or not, but when you have an adoration chapel, particularly a perpetual adoration chapel, every so often, Father will consecrate a new host to put in the monstrance, to put in the adoration chapel, right? Well, that day was a day that he was supposed to consecrate a new host. But when Father got to Mass that morning, he looked in the tabernacle, and the host was already in the tabernacle. And so he presumed that the priest yesterday had consecrated the host for the monstrance and just not put it in there yet. And so he went and took the one that was in the tabernacle and put it in the adoration chapel. And later that night, that afternoon, the lady who was filling in as sacristan said, hey, Father, did you see I had put out the host for you to consecrate at Mass for the adoration chapel? And he's like, what are you talking about? He's like, I didn't see it on the credence table. And she's like, no, I put it in the tabernacle, which you're never supposed to do. Don't ever put an unconsecrated host in a tabernacle, okay? Only ones that are already consecrated. So he put an unconsecrated host in the adoration chapel till he realized it. She said this to him. He immediately went and got it, replaced it with a consecrated host, a little tiny one, because that's what he had, till he could get the big monstrance one consecrated and put it in there. So the only time since that experience in World Youth Day I've ever doubted whether or not Jesus was really present was because it wasn't actually Jesus. For those like 6 hours, the Adoration Chapel had an unconsecrated host in the monstrance, which is why Father was freaking out at a staff meeting the next day, rightly so. I felt so much better though. I was so relieved. Like, I'm sorry, Father, that you're in a panic, but I thought I was having a crisis of faith. Right? But this was this encounter moment that I had. Now, it didn't change the course of my life. I didn't give Jesus a yes in that moment. I had a lot of college that happened after that, right? But it was this moment that really was the first time I can remember having an encounter that was like, this is something different. I can't blow it off. I can't brush it off. I can't pretend like it was something else. But this was God in some way, shape, or form communicating with me directly. Why? I don't know. Probably so I can share the story. So I want you to think about, do you have a moment of encounter? What happened to me, this is not a St. Paul story, right? This is not a drug addict pulled out of the gutter story. It's not, sexy, but it's real. It's what happened. It's what happened to me. I want you to think about if you've ever had an encounter that you knew God was real, that something happened. A friend of mine likes to call it, you had an ookie spooky, right? You had one of those moments, and maybe you've not shared it with somebody else because you think they're going to think I'm crazy. They're going to think I'm making it up. They're going to think I'm reading into something that wasn't really there, right? But have you ever had this moment where you were like, I think that was God. I think that was Jesus trying to communicate with me, tell me something. Spend just 2 minutes thinking about that for yourself. And then I want you to turn and talk to the people around you and ask them if they have a moment. You don't have to share your moment yet if you don't want to, right? But just, can you think of a moment when you've had an encounter with God? If you already have one, you can turn and talk right away, but some people need time to think. Okay, take about 1 minute. 1 minute. Okay, so I've just been standing up here thinking about, I want to share with you a conversion moment from my life, right? So we talk about encounter moments with God, right? Those times where God goes from being outside my life to a part of my life or maybe a bigger part of my life. Then we have those moments where we're invited to say yes to something from Jesus. And I've been standing up here thinking, and I told one story this morning at the session there, but I don't think that's the story that I'm supposed to share with you, so I'm going to share a different one. Because here's the thing, right? If the only encounter story I ever have is one that happened when I was 17, that's going to lose a little bit of its impact. It's going to lose its impact for me personally, and it's going to lose its impact for the people closest to me if I'm sharing life and faith with them, right? If they're like, what's God done in your life? And every time I'm like, well, this one time when I was 17, right? So we need to be aware of and sharing these encounter moments that happen on a more regular basis in our lives. The other thing I want to say is that one of the beautiful things about sharing story, there's a part in the Mass that's called the anamnesis, which is a really fancy, probably Greek, because they usually are, word for memory. And it's different in each Eucharistic prayer, exactly what the words are, but it's a point at which Father will say something about a memorial or memory or we remember or something like that, depending on the Eucharistic prayer. And the anamnesis is this word that means to remember, but not like to remember where I put my car keys, right? Or to remember the sound of my grandmother's voice. But it's a word that means to remember in such a way as to make it real again. Because that's what we do at Mass, right? This memorial sacrifice is not a new one. We are doing it in memory in such a way, we're remembering in such a way that we actually make it real again. That time and space come together and we are experiencing the Last Supper again, here, now, at every Mass. Well, in a similar way, the same thing happens when we share our stories of what God has done. This story that happened in World Youth Day in France, I went back that night and I wrote about it in my little trip journal that I was keeping and never told a soul about it. And probably 7 years later, was on a retreat where the retreat director was asking us to try to remember, right, the earliest encounter with God that we could remember. And as he's doing this whole experiential meditation, kind of helping us, Holy Spirit, enlighten my memory and take me back to this place and all the stuff that he's doing, the story is coming to mind. And on the retreat, 7 years later, I was like, did that really happen? I mean, I have a pretty active imagination. Am I remembering that? Or did I just make it up on this retreat because it would be really cool if something like that happened? And I got back from this retreat and I went home and pulled out my trip journal because it's a book, and as a former English teacher, you never, ever, ever get rid of a book unless you are giving it away to someone else to read it. So I pull out my old trip journal and I start flipping through it and I find exactly what I had remembered on that retreat written out in my trip journal. But for 7 years, I had never told anyone about it. And you know what had happened over the course of those 7 years? Like memories do, it had faded. I had forgotten about it. That certainty that Jesus was in the Eucharist never left. But where it came from, or what that was all about, or what had happened, all those details had kind of faded away over time. And once it came back to me, and once I started reading about it again, and started talking to some people who were part of the retreat, we were doing small groups after the retreat, and talking to them about it, it like brought it all back again in a way that made it real again for me, and made it real again for the people I was sharing it with. When we share these stories of what God does, it's not just another cool story. It's not just another thing that happened, but it's actually making real God's presence again for ourselves and for the people around us. That's why it's so essential that we share these stories when they happen. Even if they're weird ones, even if you think people are going to look at you like side-eye or think you're crazy or get the men in the white coats or whatever it is, like just tell one person who's safe then, okay? But tell somebody when it happens, because it makes it more real for you and for them when you share that story. All right, so now conversion story that happened to me. After my husband and I had been married for about a year, we found out that I had, through a whole divine intervention confluence of events, we found out that I had kidney disease, that I had been having low-grade chronic kidney infections for most of my life that were asymptomatic. So they weren't ever getting treated, but they were slowly scarring my kidneys. And so when we got married, again about a year later, we found out that I had, at that time, 35% kidney function at like 23 years old. And I went to a nephrologist when we found this out, and he addressed the issue that had been causing it to happen to begin with. But once you lose that much kidney function, you're kind of in like this vicious spiral that you can't get out of, because your kidneys are one of the organs in your bodies that do not regenerate. Once the nephrons are dead, they're dead. And so he kind of was saying to us, look, like chances are you are going to at some point need either to go on dialysis or have a transplant. And I can't tell you when that's going to happen, because we just don't know how fast this is going to progress or how slow it might not progress. He said, but if you were thinking about having children, you should do that now, immediately. My husband and I were like, okay. I mean, we weren't opposed to the idea, but I guess we're going to actually try to have kids. And we were very fortunate. We got pregnant with my oldest son almost right away. As soon as we started trying, we were able to get pregnant with him. We were very, very blessed in that way. And I had then an OB and a nephrologist who were watching my pregnancies to make sure things were okay, because pregnancies can be hard on your kidneys, especially as the baby grows and starts to depend more and more on the mom's body. So I got to, it would have been 35 weeks of pregnancy, and my OB, my nephrologist, called my OB and said, her kidneys are starting to show strain. We should probably look at inducing labor. As long as the baby's lungs are good enough, we should probably induce labor so she doesn't lose any kidney function. My OB says, no problem. I go in for an appointment on Friday. She says, we're going to induce labor on Monday morning. I want you to be here at 9 o'clock. Like, okay, sounds good. A little early, but not so early that we were super concerned. And on Sunday night, my water broke at home. In fact, my water broke at home, and what happened first is our dog that we had at the time started freaking out, and he peed on the floor in the middle of the night and was barking, and my husband is like, what the heck? This stupid dog, what are you doing? You're potty trained. And my husband thought the dog was sick and went to go sleep downstairs, because we didn't let the dog up in the bedroom. He slept in the down in the living room and kitchen area. He went to go sleep on the couch with the dog, because he was concerned about the dog. And it turns out the dog probably knew that I was in labor before I knew I was in labor. Was freaking out. And so I get up then, and I'm yelling for my husband because my water has broken. And he's like, what? Oh my gosh, okay, unexpected. Well, we were planning to have this baby tomorrow anyway, so great. So we go in, I have the baby. Now, when my husband and I tell this story sometimes together, when I tell the story, I say, and after a pretty decent labor, fine, nothing crazy happens, right? We have Vinny, he's happy, he's healthy, everything's great, and I go home from the hospital, and 6 weeks later, I go in for a checkup, and they tell me that my kidneys have no additional damage from the pregnancy, and I am like, this is amazing. Now, My husband's experience, he would tell you I left some things out of that story. Like, for example, the fact that not long after Vinny was born, I started massively hemorrhaging and had to go in for emergency surgery to stop hemorrhaging. And our son, because his lungs were slightly underdeveloped, was on under an oxygen tent. They didn't need to ventilate him or anything. He didn't have to go to the NICU, but they just had him in the nursery under an oxygen tent. So within an hour of what has been the happiest moment of my husband's life, he's standing in a hospital room by himself. This is not how this is supposed to go. Now, I was fine. They did the emergency surgery. Everything was fine. By the time I got back from surgery, I didn't even know Vinny had been under the oxygen tent because he was already out of it. So, like I said, my experience was, this was great and wonderful. Not so much my husband's experience, to be fair. So, about a year and a half later, we decide we'd like to try to have another baby. And so we're going to try. Yep, sure enough. Again, very quickly, got pregnant with our daughter, Elizabeth. Right around 35, 36 weeks of pregnancy, my nephrologist says, hey, we should look at inducing because her kidneys are starting to show that they might be under strain again. My doctor, Anna, says, come in on Monday at 8 a.m. for an induction. I said, okay, no problem. And on Sunday afternoon, my water broke. And I went into labor on my own. And then we had Elizabeth. And this time everything did go great. No problems, no issues, no concerns. Everything's wonderful. 6 weeks later, I go in to get my kidneys checked. And again, my kidneys show no damage from the pregnancy. They've been holding pretty much status quo now for about 4 years, right around the same function level. I took this information as, this is beautiful and amazing and wonderful, and God has taken such amazing care of us. We can now have the 7, 8, or 9 children that I've always wanted to have. My husband, however, did not feel that way. My husband's attitude was, we rolled the dice twice, and we got lucky. And we have a happy, healthy baby boy and a happy, healthy baby girl. And I have a happy, healthy wife. Right? And I think we should be done. I don't think we should roll the dice again. And I was not on board with this plan. Not even a little bit. See, ever since I was a little girl, the only thing I ever wanted to be when I grew up was a mom. That's all I ever wanted to be was a mom. And I would have had, a whole barn full of kids if I could. That's what I wanted, right? Big family, lots of kids, the whole thing. Well, what started to happen then over the next year and a half is that my husband and I started to slowly but surely turn what was a discussion into a debate, into an argument, into 2 very firmly entrenched positions, and slowly but surely actually turned into a lot of anger and bitterness at each other. We weren't actually dealing with the issue. We were just talking past each other about what we both wanted. At the same time, I was taking some of my graduate classes, and I was learning about the theology of the body and the church's amazing, beautiful, incredible teaching. And I was not the most soft-hearted in the way I would approach these issues with my husband. And by that I mean there were times where we would stand in our kitchen yelling at each other. And he would say, I just don't understand why you can't trust me. I just want to take care of you. And I would say, I just don't understand why you can't trust God and that he's going to take care of me better than you can. And then he would say, but I didn't marry you so that you could have kids and die. I married you to be with you and hopefully with kids too, but with you. And I said to him, every time that we are together and you don't want to have a baby, you're stealing sacramental graces from me. I do not recommend this line of argument. It is not fruitful, okay? Not fruitful whatsoever. But we both start just getting to the point where we are not even able to remotely talk to each other about it anymore. And as you can imagine, this has a huge strain on our relationship. And it's getting to a point now where we're not even talking to each other about anything, let alone this particular issue, because we both are very stubborn. And we both have just gotten more further entrenched in our rightness about this. And I thought I was right because I had the church on my side, in my opinion. because I could cite you theology that would prove my argument was accurate. And he was like, I don't care about that, because that's not what matters to me right now in all of this, which just pushed us, right, further and further apart. So we get to a point where it's like, we might not even, like, this marriage might not survive this issue. We were so upset and angry and bitter with each other. So we decide we're going to go to see a marriage counselor. So we go to see this marriage counselor, and we sit down at our first appointment, and we're explaining to her, we went through Catholic Charities in our diocese, and we're explaining to her what was going on. She was great. She was listening, right? She gave us each something she wanted us to think about before the next appointment. We came back, and at the next appointment, she looked at my husband, and she said, is this a marriage-ending issue for you? And we had just the night before had a huge argument about it. And he would tell you, out of anger and frustration, he looked at that counselor and went, maybe. And she looked at me and she said, is this a marriage-ending issue for you? And I burst into tears and walked out of the appointment, because I was like, I don't even know what to do now. So fast forward to would have been our third appointment with the counselor. And just before we go into our third appointment with a counselor, things are not 100% right with me physically, and I take a pregnancy test and find out, surprise, I'm expecting number 3. See, I had told my husband we would do natural family planning while we were trying to figure this out, and I was like, I'm smart. I can read a book and do natural family planning. Okay, don't do that, all right? It does not work. You need people who know how to do that to help coach you and teach you what to do. You can't just read a book and do it on your own. I mean, maybe if you have a medical degree, which I do not, so it was not a good thing. So we get to the appointment. My husband gets there first. I am late, as usual. And he's sitting in the waiting room waiting for me, and I walk off the elevator. And he looked at me, and I was like white. And he goes, I walk off the elevator, and he goes, what? And all I said was, well, and he went, you're pregnant. And I said, yeah, I just found out. And the counselor comes out. She's like, hi, come on back. You know, that poor lady, to this day, I'm like, oh my, I'm so sorry. We sit down, and she goes, so, where are we at today? And my husband crosses both of his arms and looks at her and goes, well, I just found out she's pregnant, so what do you want to talk about? And she says, what do you mean just? And he goes, in the waiting room. She says, oh my, maybe we should sit with this for a minute. Which I think now, having like been, a youth minister and educator, whatever, was her way of going, oh crap, I need to think about what I'm going to do next for a minute. We sat there for probably 60 seconds in silence. And my husband stood up, and he looked at her, and he said, well, there's no point in us doing this now, because it's already been decided, so you can bill me for the session. And he walked out. And he was even more angry at that point. And he left that appointment and made an appointment with a urologist to get a vasectomy that very day. He called and made the appointment to go get a vasectomy, knowing that this was like 100% against what I believe was right. But in his mind, it was, I can't trust my wife to consider my thoughts, my feelings, my desires in this. I've tried to walk with her as she wants to do this, but now I'm just going to take care of it. So we have Isaac, right? I'm pregnant with Isaac, and same story. Just getting to like 35, 36 weeks, nephrologist calls the OB. This time my OB says to me, why don't you come in Monday for an induction at 8 o'clock, which means I will see you Sunday. And my water broke on Sunday. I did not realize it's actually super rare for women's water to break at home, because all 3 times it happened right before I was getting induced. On my own, my water broke. And so I went in, we had Isaac, no problems. Everything is just humming along beautifully, wonderfully. And we get done, go home, 6 weeks. And my husband was like loving. He didn't like not love Isaac or care, right? Like it's not the baby's fault that this has all happened. And he adores his son. But 6 weeks later, I go in for my follow-up appointment with my kidney doctor, who says that once again, my kidneys have shown no effect from pregnancy. And now, instead of just being angry and frustrated, now this deep resentment starts to build in me. Because by now my husband has had a vasectomy, and I am like, I told you God would take care of me, and you didn't trust. And now every time that I find out someone that I know is expecting a baby, instead of being happy for them, I am sad, I'm hurt, I'm frustrated. I felt like literally every single month I had a physical reminder that I was never going to be able to have any more children because of what had happened. And it gets to a point where nothing is improved in our relationship. We just now have 3 kids instead of 2 kids. And I'm talking with a friend of mine one day, and I say to her, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go from here. And she looked at me and she said, you have to forgive your husband. I said, I know that, but I don't know how. I don't even know what that would look like at this point. And she gave me some of the just greatest, best advice I've ever gotten from someone. She said to me, well, fake it. I was like, excuse me? And she said, fake it. She goes, why don't you try this? Try pretending like you have already forgiven your husband. And then this is the key. She said, and every time you have to do that, she said, ask Jesus to come into your heart and forgive him for you. And I was like, I will try anything at this point. Fine. Again, not like a, yes, Lord, that sounds amazing and beautiful and lovely. Fine. So I start, little by little, trying to okay, I'm going to treat this man as if I have already forgiven him. And every time, and sometimes for all day long, I'm like, Jesus, you better forgive him, because I can't. I don't know how. I don't know what this is looking like. It wasn't like a, Lord, please come and fill me with your light of love. It was like, you better, right now, forgive this man, because I don't know how to. And slowly over time, I started to realize that actually, I wasn't as angry quite so much anymore. I wasn't as bitter quite so much anymore. And I went back to my friend and I was like, how do you know it works? How do you know if it happened? She goes, I don't know. It was just something to try. I'm like, that is not helpful. She said, I think one day you're just going to realize that it worked. Right? I don't think that there's a magic thing. I think it just one day you're going to go, oh my gosh, look at that, it worked. She's like, that's what I hope anyway. I'm like, all right. So my sister, who's 2 years younger than I am, told me one day she was unexpectedly pregnant with her 4th child. It wasn't an unhappy unexpected, just unexpectedly pregnant with her 4th child. And she called to tell me, and I was just thrilled for her. I was just so happy for her when she told me this news. And my husband came home that night, and I was like, guess what? And he's like, what? I said, oh my gosh, Steph and Peter, they're going to have a 4th. Can you believe it? They thought they were done, and now this is amazing and wonderful. And my husband, when we tell this story together, will tell you he spent the next month walking on eggshells around me because he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. He was waiting for the resentment to come in, right? The bitterness and the anger. And it wasn't until a month later when he actually asked me about it, he was like, so we're okay? I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, with Steph having another baby? And I was like, what? Yeah? Steph's the one having the baby. Why would we not be okay? He's like, well, and all of a sudden it clicked for me, and I realized that exactly what I had asked Jesus to do for me, he had done. That he had forget. And this bitterness and this anger was gone. And I didn't even know where it had gone. And I can't even to this day tell you exactly the mechanism or the how it happened. All I can tell you is that slowly but surely, I was not angry and bitter with my husband anymore. And about a year later, well, not quite a year, it was actually right around my time my sister had her baby, we were asked to give a presentation at a friend's parish for a Valentine's Day couples dinner. They were like, you and Tony, you have this great marriage, because nobody knew what was going on, right? You hide all that stuff. You guys have this great, beautiful, holy marriage. You should come and give this talk. And we're like, sure. And the Friends Parish was about 4 hours away from our house. And we did not discuss what we were going to talk about until we got in the car for the 4-hour drive. And we're both tiptoeing around each other. So, what are we going to say? How are we going to talk? What should this be about? And my husband goes, well, I kind of feel like maybe we should talk about the thing. And I'm like, if you're thinking the same thing I'm thinking, then you're probably right. We're just like, right? And finally it was like, okay, let's just put all our cards out on the table. So we get to this event and we share this story with everybody. Now, because this is the way it works sometimes, it was not until we are speaking in front of a group of strangers that I find out that my husband, when I had found out my sister was expecting, and had gone that month without getting angry or bitter or upset or frustrated or resenting him again, that he had started to have an experience of conversion of his own, where he started to say, you know what? Maybe I didn't handle that right. Like maybe there was a different way for me to go about this that would not have been so hurtful, that would not have made my wife feel so betrayed, that wouldn't have been so problematic. And my husband went to confession 2 weeks before we went and gave this talk for the first time since our wedding. And he confessed all the things that had happened as a result of this. And I didn't know that until we're talking in front of a room full of strangers. And he's like, and I went to confession. And of course, I'm crying then. And the priest comes and gives us a big hug. And he's like, isn't that a beautiful story? And I'm like, yes, it's a beautiful story, right? So I share that with you because I want you to know that God works. All he asks for is that little bit of yes from us, that little bit of permission, that little bit of invitation. All he needed from me in order to work in my marriage was for me to say, I'm willing to give you my bitterness and my anger and my hurt, Lord. My betrayal I'm willing to give to you instead of holding it on for myself and lashing out at my husband every chance I could get. Now, our marriage is still by no means perfect, right? But I will tell you that experience has brought us so much closer together and has actually made us more likely, each of us, to turn to God when the other one hurts rather than lash out. Because I'm like, man, I wish I would have known that way earlier in this process. I could have not had to go through a lot of what we went through if I would have known that this is how this could have ended, if I would have done it that much earlier, right? So, not my first conversion, but yet still a time where Jesus brought healing and wholeness and restoration into my life, and then had an invitation for me to step in, to lean in, to offer even more of it up to him. And every time I've said yes to that, it's been beautiful and amazing and wonderful. And in fact, I ended up having this little side ministry that for the longest time, I was like, what is happening and where is this coming from? I would have women who would reach out to me. And I mean women that was like, a friend of a friend told me I should talk to you, right? A former teenager who is now married and has kids of her own would be like, I remember one time you were nice at church. Can I talk to you? I'm like, sure. And every time, it was, for years and years, it's been women whose husbands have cheated on them. That's who I get coming out and asking me for help. Can I talk to you? Can you pray for me? Can we talk about this, whatever? And I had one point where I was like, God, what is happening? Where are all these women coming from? And I was talking with another friend of mine, and I was like, yeah, I don't know. It's this weird little thing that God is doing over here on the side. And she goes, women who feel betrayed by their husbands and who are angry, but you don't know where this is coming from? I was like, oh. Because remember I said yesterday, God shines out of the places that he has brought healing. That's never something I would have ever imagined. I didn't even put those pieces together until my friend pointed out. She's like, well, sure, because Jesus brought healing for you in a marriage where you felt betrayed and you were angry and bitter. Just because it wasn't for the same reason doesn't mean that there's not still something to offer for these women. She's like, so you should be giving them the same advice that your friend gave you. I'm like, I do, but I never even thought about it that way before. Because this is the new life he brings to us in this. So I want you to think about a moment in your life where you had a conversion, where you had a change that happened. And the framework, very, very simple framework is this. I was, Jesus did, now I am. If I were just to put it in the 3 sentences, it would be I was angry and bitter and hurt by having felt like I was betrayed by my husband. Jesus forgave my husband for me when I didn't know how and didn't think I ever could. And now I am in a marriage that is stronger than it ever was before we went through what we went through, and am able to actually help other people who are feeling that same way in their marriages. The key here in this framework is to make it about what Jesus does, not about what I did. Because my story could sound like I was angry and hurt and bitter, right, and frustrated and betrayed by my husband, and I prayed and forgave him, and now I am. And that's true. It's true, but it's missing the most important element, which was it wasn't about what I did. It was about what Jesus did. So if you have a story of forgiveness, right? It's really easy, those of us who've been in the church for a long time, for our story to sound like I was trapped in a pattern of sin or addiction, or had this thing I kept doing, I didn't even know why I was doing it, and I went to confession, and I was forgiven, and now I don't struggle with that temptation anymore. I've been freed from that, and that is a story that is all about I, me. Now, if you're telling it to people inside the church, maybe they will be able to recognize that when you say, I went to confession, is actually shorthand for, and Jesus forgave me in confession, right? Because I went to him. He forgave me. But we can't presume that people will speak that shorthand. We actually need to make it clear. Jesus is the protagonist of our story. What did he do that brought you to a new place, to where you are today, that brought you to a change, to a shift, to a conversion? Sometimes the story can be like, I was, and then the church. And I just want you to know that the church, when we speak about it that way, is a building or an institution. What did Jesus do for you through the church? Through the ministry of the church or the people in the church or whatever the case might be. What did Jesus do for you through the church? What did Jesus do for you in a sacrament, at a mass, in confession, in prayer, right? What did he do? Keep him at the center of your story. So we're going to end tonight by, this is your homework. Not even homework, it's your in-church work before you leave. I want you to get with one person, just one person, pair up with one person. I want you to share with that person a story of how God has worked in your life. It can be just an encounter moment, if that's what you're comfortable sharing. It can be an I was, Jesus did, now I am. Not your whole life story. We probably don't have time for that, but just a moment, a time that God has moved and worked in your life. And I want you to share it with someone. I want you to share it with someone who has not yet heard this story from you. So if you're here with a spouse who knows all your stories already, either come up with a new one or find somebody else. Okay? Now, while you are listening to someone's story, you have one job. One job while you're listening to someone's story for the purposes of this exercise. You are not allowed to speak. Don't speak. Just listen to their story and allow yourself to be fascinated by the way God has worked in someone else's life. And when they're done, tell them, thank you for sharing your story. You might have all kinds of connections with their story. You might be like, oh my gosh, the same thing happened to me. That's amazing and that's wonderful. Until you're both done sharing your story, you don't get to say any of that. Because otherwise what happens? You go off on the tangents and the rabbit holes and you end up talking about all the other things instead of actually sharing your story. Just listen to the person's story, say thank you for sharing, and then let the other person share. When you've done that, right? When you've done that, if you feel comfortable, pray together, right? And it doesn't have to be like a loud, spontaneous prayer. You can just say an Our Father together or Hail Mary together, right? For each other, to lift them up. It's in thanksgiving for people sharing their stories, for us being able to see how God is working in each other's lives. If you want to come downstairs and share your story with a glass of wine and maybe some snacks, you're welcome to do that because we'll be down there as well. If you want to stay in here, that's fine as well, whatever you would like to do. But the key to this is, do not let this be the only time you share your story. Look for the ways God moves and works in your life on a regular basis and be willing to share those with other people. Look at the people who've been here at this mission. I tell you, they at least will not look at you crazy if you say, hey, I have a story, I think I'm supposed to share it with you because we've been spending 3 days talking about it, right? But be willing to share that for yourself so that you can make real again what has happened for you and so that other people can be lifted up in their faith as well. Your stories matter. They speak into today's world in a particular and unique way. And they speak the story that God is writing throughout every one of our lives when you are willing to share just what he's done for you, right? I obviously can't make you stay here and do this, but I just want you to know I'll be very sad if you don't stay. All right, so please stick around. Yes. Absolutely. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for asking. So I have to tell you, I have my husband's permission to tell this story, and he always says, yes, of course you can tell it, because I ask him, right, because it's a personal story. He said, of course you can tell it. He said, but you have to then ask them to pray for your kidneys. So please pray for my kidneys. Thank you for asking. I am currently, my kidneys are at about 20% function. I have lost about 1% a year just over time, which is what's expected. I am on a transplant list, but I am inactive because I don't need one right now, but I can build up wait time on the transplant list, and the goal is for me to get a transplant before I would need dialysis. It's called a preemptive transplant. It's not about percentage anymore. So I'm at a percentage now where I could get it if I start to, it's all about how I feel and what the electrolyte levels in my blood are, which are fine right now. So far, I'm good. But yeah, if you would please pray for me, pray for my kidneys. My husband says I'm supposed to tell you to pray for miraculous, bold healing for my kidneys. So that's what I'm asking for on his behalf as well. But but like I said, it's been a great journey and super interesting. I've had so many of my family members and friends who are like, I'll give you a kidney, I'll give you a kidney, I'll give you a kidney. It's just incredible. It's been really beautiful to see. But thank you. So thank you for asking. So now, your turn. Share your stories, please, with each other.